My name's Shahid. I've been fighting for our rights as Americans in both San Francisco and Washington, D.C. for 20 years. I'm a Muslim. I'm also a DJ, an MC, a public interest advocate, an educator, and a grassroots organizer. And I've written and spoken across the country on behalf of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I've worked since 2015 as EFF's Director of Grassroots Advocacy. I'm running for Congress because San Francisco needs someone to represent our city's values in Washington. I did so for a decade, long before running for office. If you're fed up with Washington, or shackled by student debt, or buried by your medical bills or your housing costs, don't send a pillar of the establishment back to represent us. I've fought for your rights in the courts, in the policy sphere, in the media, and in the streets, from Occupy to the immigrant rights movement, from the digital rights community to the movement for Black lives. I've been building social movements here in San Francisco since 2003. Are you tired of watching our concerns as San Franciscans fall on deaf ears in Washington? I am. Here in SF, we stand for transparency, for freedom, for inclusion, and for opportunity. I know what it's like to struggle. My family immigrated twice, from Pakistan to England and then to the US to escape discrimination. We lived the American dream for over a decade. Then we lost our house, just as I started college. After graduating, shortly after the war broke out, I moved east to champion SF's values in our nation's capital as a constitutional lawyer, a grassroots organizer, and a nonprofit leader. Since then, I've directed programs for 3 national nonprofits and led another as executive director for 6 years. We need a fresh voice in Congress, one for whom resistance is more than just a hashtag. That's why I'm asking for your vote and for your support. My name's Shahid Buttar. Visit shahidforchange.us. It would be my honor to represent you and our beautiful, liberated, and welcoming city in Washington. I'm Shahid Buttar, and I approve this message.
All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to We the People. I totally cut in early on his video because I'm so excited to talk to this guy. That is one of the best campaign ads I have ever seen, honestly. It was so well done, and it's pretty comprehensive. I was just going to say we're going to take questions now. Not really sure what more we need to go into there. We the People are going to meet Shahid Buttar, who is running for California's 12th Congressional District, which, yeah, that's Nancy Pelosi world. And it's really kind of cool because we've already interviewed one progressive for this role and was very impressed. But wait till you hear this guy. The reputation is going to blow you away. I'm impressed. Shahid, thank you for joining us on We the People.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. Yeah. And before we get going, this is going to be so cool. Yeah, hey, everybody. I see you out there. Hey, Brom. Hey, Metalhead. Hey, Alpha Gray. Phil. Let's bring on the lovely Laura Livengood so she can tell you how you guys can engage. And then we'll go from there. Laura.
Well, you guys know the drill, but for any of you who are new to the program, if you are watching live, you have the unique opportunity to ask questions of our guests during the show. So if you have a question, I will drop his website into chat so you can check out his platform. But if you have a burning question for Shahid, please write question all in caps or tag me, and we will ask during an appropriate break in the action.
Thank you,
John.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. Shahid, first of all, thank you for running. It is the most difficult thing to do.
You're very kind, John. I appreciate it.
I'm not going to do it, so thank you. Why? Why did you choose to run? We're going to get into your history. You've got an amazing history of activism, of just incredible stuff. We're going to talk about a great resume, but I'm going to tease that for ratings. Tell me why you decided to run against Nancy Pelosi in a field riddled with other people right now.
Yeah. You know, the discrete reason I ran is that working at EFF, watching Congress this spring on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act vote basically extend and expand the surveillance powers available to the Trump administration, and watching Nancy Pelosi undermine a proposed warrant requirement that would have constrained mass surveillance by the NSA, the FBI, and the DEA. That is the thing that got me thinking about it. And then I really started examining the other candidates. And quite frankly, if I thought any of them were poised to win the race, I wouldn't be doing this. What really pushed me into it was a few weeks later on the budget deal, when Pelosi went through this stunt of reading for 8 hours from letters from immigrant students and then voting in a backroom deal to throw them under the bus. And being an immigrant myself, who happens to be very deeply steeped in the mass surveillance issues where she is particularly weak, as well as the human rights issues where she is particularly weak, I just felt like I quite frankly couldn't stand aside and watch and still feel good about myself. This race needs someone who can win it. This particular city needs someone who is an unapologetic, skilled, experienced, progressive champion to promote its values in Washington. And I dare say our country needs San Francisco to be represented faithfully in Congress. And that's ultimately why I'm running.
Wow. Okay. There was a lot in there. I mean, boom. Thank you. Let's start with you're an immigrant and you understand, well, I just got to say, I apologize as a white person of privilege for the way all POCs are being treated in this country right now.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's good allyship.
I don't share your fear because but I worry about it. I don't understand it. I can't comprehend it. But if I were a person of color, I would be frightened to be on the streets today, especially in certain places to live. Do you feel that way? We're going to jump into advocacy for privacy, but do you feel that way in San Francisco right now? Are you afraid to walk the streets of your city?
Absolutely not. And I've never been afraid to walk the streets of any American city. I mean, ultimately, I feel like I will echo FDR here. I dare say that the greatest thing we have to fear is fear itself. And I think that's one of the reasons we're in this mess. I mean, if you step back from the xenophobia targeting immigrants to just think about the extent to which American policy is filtered through the lens of fear.
Yes.
And, how much of our, for instance, our military industrial complex is rooted in fear of, unknown threats. When we have known threats, often paid for by our tax dollars that are abusing us, the chimera of fear and the way it is co-opted and abused and taken advantage of, whether by corporations or by government intelligence agencies, I think is a big part of the problem. So, I would say, and all that aside, San Francisco is a particularly welcoming city to people of all kinds. It's always been a city of iconoclasts. Our city was it is the antithesis of the establishment, and it's always occupied a role both as a counterculture and as an engine of economic development on the fringe of the central economy. And so while American industry might have its own trajectory, the innovations that have happened here in the last generation and the cultural innovations that long precede that, going back to the roots of San Francisco in the gold rush even, this is a place that has always identified itself as an iconoclast, and it's always charted its own cultural course. It's the same course that I would like to see reflected in federal policy in Washington.
Nice. Okay, well, good. Glad to know. In other parts of this country, I probably cannot say the same, and we see an awful lot of violence coming from a bunch of different places, all rooted in the fear, I think, all rooted in the fear and the narrative of violence. And I kind of want to take off on that right there and just ask you, what do you think about what's going on right now with gun violence, and how tied in is it with police violence, and what do we need to do about it?
Great question. I love that you connected those two things, because I think that is the crux. So obviously, we are living through a constitutional crisis that is threatening the lives of millions of Americans. It is a no-brainer to support a ban on assault-style rifles. There's no reason that civilians should have them. And I will offer this a lot. When I was at the March for Lives not long ago, I guess the week before this last weekend, the Saturday before this one passed, I had an opportunity to speak with Dennis Bernstein from Flashpoints, and he gave me a chance to describe my Second Amendment theory on national radio. And it goes like this. A lot of conservatives are concerned about Second Amendment rights. And to the extent they locate gun control as a threat to their interests, there's a little bit of a bait and switch in that they're barking up the wrong tree. The Second Amendment isn't actually about weapons. The text of the amendment refers to them, but the purpose of the Second Amendment is a right to resistance against the federal government. It's the constitutional escape hatch passed at the time of the founding for colonies that were fearful that the federal government would run roughshod over their rights. It's why the text of the Second Amendment grounds the right to bear arms, particularly in a well-regulated militia. So in 2008, the Supreme Court radically reinterpreted it and created an individual right to weapons for the first time. But stepping back from that aberration to consider the arc of the Second Amendment over the nation's founding, it's a liberty right to resistance. And if we ask Second Amendment enthusiasts today, what is the thing that inhibits your right to resistance? The answer can't be, in good faith, gun control, because that's not the answer. The reason that there is no meaningful right to resistance today is because the police have become militarized. And the militarization of police presents the threat to Second Amendment interests that many of its defenders mistake for being gun control. And I do think that that opportunity to diffuse Second Amendment concerns, to recognize common cause in the liberty interest, and to unite that coalition against the militarization of police is one of the political opportunities of our generation.
Wow. Well said. Well said. I think, to me, the part of the greater issue there is that and you mentioned it, or we were talking about it in a green room, but the narrative, and in 2008, the court reinterpreted the Second Amendment, but it was also because of the pressure that we had a Tea Party that was using Second Amendment to talk about, we got to retake our government, Obama's going to take away our guns, blah, blah. That whole initiative was that fear-based change on what the Second Amendment was about, right?
It was a big part of it. But I guess when I think about the rise of the Tea Party in that context, what I particularly think about is the opportunity for populism, and in that case, populism coming from a different political alignment,
yes,
to challenge the partisan establishment. And in that respect, I dare say that I'm rather inspired by that wave of activism, if only because they managed to displace a whole bunch of moderates who were constraining a vision that I don't share in all parts, but I do see members of that political tribe, for instance, challenging mass surveillance. I see them, that's one of the issues in particular where I see a confluence between libertarians and progressives. And having seen the Tea Party quite literally expand the ranks of members of Congress who are willing to fight the NSA, it is at least a mitigated good. And you're absolutely right that fear is driving that movement. You see it expressed both in the vilification of immigrants, as well as what some people might describe as a paranoid fixation on weapons. And at the end of the day, I would just remind people concerned about the Second Amendment rights that it's not having guns that you should fear. It is police having military weapons and training and tactics without the restraint of an engagement policy. The pattern and practice of police violence that's repeated itself and been demonstrated all over the country, that is the thing to be concerned about. Absolutely. Not the abstract denial of some weapon.
Absolutely. I mean, and I agree with you on the Tea Party, because I'm not there with them in their beliefs, but like you said, we need to make sure that the government doesn't have, they're in the same, like you said, there's just some lines there, some moral lines there, but we've been talking about the Tea Party. We were talking about them all 2017. Here's what they did. They were able to infiltrate and take over a GOP and really infuse their ideas into it, and look at what's happened to it.
And I hope that progressives can do the same thing to the Democratic Party.
Yes.
A big part of the reason I'm running actually was seeing what Bernie was able to demonstrate in 2016, which is that the Democratic base has not entirely forgotten progressivism.
Right.
And also that I think as we march into a progressive future, that there is a part of the party base that is also willing to maintain an attachment to liberty. It is progressivism shorn from liberty principles that leads to a very dangerous place. And it is, conservatism fetishizing liberty principles that leads also to a very nightmarish place. And I think that there's an opportunity, particularly as a progressive challenging a bipartisan corporate establishment, to put the interests of people before profit. And to champion those principles and the policies that would promote communities and families and give people opportunities to pursue their own happiness.
Absolutely. Well, it sure seems like it's the time. It just seems like the progressive movement is there. We just are fighting an awful lot of roadblocks. And like you said, the militarization of the police is a frightening aspect, because it really not only inhibits our right to protest, but can cause a lot of other damage. How do you say we address what do we need to do with our cops? I'm just going to express from my point of view. I grew up as a white guy who trusted cops. right? Because I had no reason. And in the instances that I had in my life, and believe me, I was a troublemaker, and I went to jail, and I did stupid things. But I think back now on all those instances, and if I had been a person of color, more than likely I'd be dead or in prison right now. That was back then. Today, if I were a person of color, I would be afraid. So I'm just, what do we do to de-escalate cops? How do we fix this situation? How do we get cops to stand up against their brothers? That's my bigger issue.
That's a big one. So there are a whole bunch of things we can do in the criminal justice arena to try to shift the landscape here. The very first thing I would say is the End Racial Profiling Act. It's been pending in Congress without being enacted for over a decade, and
Nice.
I have fought for that long to try to get it passed.
Wow.
It almost passed in 2001 with the support of the Bush administration before it then fell off the congressional table after the 9/11 attacks, never to be seen again.
Right.
I have a great story involving, and this is the summer of 2010. Obama's now been in for about a year and a half. I have a meeting with a coalition. We're speaking to congressional leadership. The chair of the House Judiciary Committee, the leader of the Black Caucus, says to us that they are waiting to introduce the bill because they were then waiting for the Obama administration's support. And when it takes years to get the support from the first Black president, whose signature achievement before coming to the White House was supporting a state racial profiling policy, when it takes years to get that administration to endorse the federal equivalent, while a Republican president had embraced it before, you know something is wrong. And so the End Racial Profiling Act would do a couple things. The first thing it would do is collect data about the impacts of police stops, uses of force, arresting decisions, lethal uses of force. You know, at the moment, we literally have to turn to a British newspaper to learn the statistics of how many Americans get killed by police here every year. And that's preposterous. There's no reason we should have to go to Britain to find out what our own public servants, supposedly, right, are doing in the conduct of their official duties. Yeah. So the collection of that information is critical. The other thing IRPA would do is give citizens, residents of any kind, whether citizens or not, a right of private action, which is to say the opportunity to go to court, and here's the key, based on a disparate impact standard. So I need to take 30 seconds to unpack the significance of that. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, very powerful lever to achieve justice. It's the basis for a whole range of things, everything from Brown versus Board to opportunities to compete on equal terms in the workplace. The historical strike against the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause came, I think it was 1978, was the Washington versus Davis decision, which basically held that in order to state a claim, a constitutional claim, under the Equal Protection Clause, a litigant has to not only show disparate impact, that is to say that there was a statistical harm, but then they also have to show discriminatory intent, which is impossible. You can't prove the intent of the government agent who is doing X, Y, or Z, right? Which is why that requirement is basically the hole into which most civil rights claims sink. The IRPA, the End Racial Profiling Act, would take it off the table so that disparate impact, the statistical proof of discrimination, which the law would require the state to collect and then make available, it would be enough to state a claim in court. So that would be very powerful at the policy layer in moving departments. In terms of moving individual officers, I think one of the most important things we can do is create a national registry of killer cops. If you get fired from a police department, you should not get hired by another one. The person who killed Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old in Cleveland who was gunned down in a park within seconds of cops showing up because he had a toy rifle, that police officer had been fired from another department before, and the chief of that department said, this man should never work for a police department again. And then he ends up on the Cleveland Police Department's force, and then there's a 12-year-old dead. There's no reason that cops should be able to game jurisdictions against each other. If someone's, not fit to be a police officer somewhere, they're probably not fit to be a police officer anywhere else. Those are just two of the many reforms. A third one I'd throw out there is the legalization of cannabis at the federal level. Yeah. The prohibition is absolutely a pretext to use to criminalize not just the behavior of individuals and entire families, but entire communities. And as a lever for the failed and racist war on drugs, the prohibition of cannabis is a crucial leg to take out of the stool of the prison industrial complex. And it won't be enough to unwind it, but it will certainly do a lot, for instance, to diminish civil asset forfeitures, which are often justified on the basis of the drug war. If you legalize some of these underlying offenses, then the law enforcement abuses that rely on those criminalizations as a foundation, some of those start to get addressed too. So I think that through ending prohibition, we could deal with a whole bunch of things, not the least of which is many of the racial biases that pervade the criminal justice system at the moment.
Do you realize how many jobs and how much revenue would be lost if you took away the criminalization of pot across the United States?
Only in law enforcement. Think about how many jobs would be created, green jobs would be created across the cannabis industry supply chain.
Absolutely.
I think that there's a real contrast there between what kind of jobs do we want. And I think this is a great policy to make them very clear.
No, that's beautiful. I love that. I think a third thing for me would be that the police no longer get to scrutinize their own departments. Citizens do that.
That's a big one. Independent review you're talking about. Yeah. I'm a big fan of independent review. In a lot of places, civilian review boards become ruses, where they have theoretical responsibilities, but without the resources to conduct real investigations like subpoena power.
Right.
And, independent authorities with investigating powers, I think are really crucial. I'll be honest with you, this is a big reason why I want to serve in Congress, because I've been arrested before asking questions that no member of Congress has either the independence or the acumen to raise. The opportunity to participate in oversight hearings as an interlocutor, to be able to ask, for instance, the Attorney General questions under oath, that makes me salivate, because quite frankly, there's no way that any part of the current paradigm is defensible. And I think that, with an assertive advocate in place to raise the questions that aren't currently being asked, I think there's a great many things that we could help become available in federal policy. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of it.
All right, that's going to lead me into, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the reality of being able to use the justice system anywhere with our corrupt government. But before that, I want to tell everybody, and it looks like Laura Livengood says we have some questions, but I never even covered this with the intro. Not only are you an immigrant, but you went to law school, graduated as a constitutional lawyer. You were Occupy, Stanford Law, executive director, editor of the Stanford Environmental Law Journal, teaching assistant for Lawrence Lessig. I forgot all of this resume stuff, but you went into the law. And so everybody, just when he started talking lawyerly stuff, and this is why he knows what he's talking about. Do you really, watching what's going on with our judicial system right now, I see people like Sean King talking about we need to replace DAs that are going to actually do something. Mm-hmm. And we had a big win, I think, in Wisconsin with a more liberal Supreme Court justice.
That's right.
And I get that it has effect at state levels and lower levels. With our federal government right now, it seems to me they don't give a shit about the law. And the law is like, whatevs. And that's my impression. Is that what's going on? Or is there actually still some oversight there with the judicial branch on the federal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll answer it in a couple different ways. So one of the very first things I did as a young lawyer was help establish a group at Stanford Law School called the American Constitution Society.
Nice.
I then worked for the national organization in 2005 to 2008. And the purpose of that network, among other things, was to try to restore order, the balance in the federal judiciary. And we were responding particularly to the Bush versus Gore decision, which revealed a blatantly politicized Supreme Court jurisprudence.
Yes.
And with, in retrospect, incredibly profound consequences. Just think about how much, not only did the Bush administration manage to move in federal policy, but how much did it manage to stick through the Obama administration? And now we have, not only torture with impunity, profiling unapologetically, the prison industrial surveillance complex, available to a criminal kleptocrat at the head of the executive branch. And so, going back to the politicization of the judiciary, I'd say this: I've written a whole series of articles called Bush versus Gore Rears Its Head. And it's a 4-part series that ultimately culminates in a proposal for judicial terms to be reformulated so that they're 18 years rather than lifetime appointments that would allow more flex in the joints. Part of what you're observing is the ossification of an apparatus that grants life tenure to people who make it in. And I think people forget this. The Reagan administration and the Bush administration were hell-bent on appointing very conservative justices who were well outside the judicial mainstream. The Obama administration and the Clinton administration, going back to the 90s, did not respond in kind. They did not nominate progressive judges. They nominated moderate judges of color and women. So they diversified the federal bench, but they did not protect its ideology. And so what we end up having is neoliberals on the bench and maniacs on the bench. And I'm going to tell you a quick story of what that looks like. 2007 was the first year, if I recall correctly, it might have been 2006, that two of the justices of the Supreme Court, now Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, were on the Supreme Court. I happened to be very involved in the resistance to their nominations when they were nominated. It's striking that in their first year on the bench, the Supreme Court, I'll use a term coined by one of my own professors, circumruled, which is to say overruled by circumventing both the Brown versus Board decision and Roe versus Wade. Most Americans have no idea that this happened 11 years ago. No. Both of those precedents, they are seminal precedents on which we think of the American bedrock constitutional norms relying, right? Roe versus Wade is the access to reproductive planning services. Brown versus Board is the right not to be discriminated against, right, in the schooling process. And yet both of those decisions have been essentially neutered by contemporary Supreme Court decisions that cited those cases while essentially limiting them and effectively overruling them. And I do think part of the crisis in our country today is that most Americans have no idea that happened. And there is a jurisprudential revolution that is well underway, and you see it all the time.
It's frightening, and we're going to get to Laura Livengood's question here, but to me, one of the greater issues overarching is a lack of education of the populace and the inability to handle so much information coming at us at once.
Yep.
The facade just came down. It didn't come down slowly. It just went,
Yep. And I'd even locate that in a couple of different places. I think, one of the issues I think you're raising is that what passes for news is increasingly driven by a 24-hour news cycle, which is to say, the deranged ravings of a maniac in the middle of the night that he posts on Twitter. Yep. And that's now passes for news. And while people are distracted by the president's tweets, real things happen. Right. To which we're not responding. The issue that we started with at the beginning, the extension of the mass surveillance powers available to the DEA, and the FBI, and the NSA, major national media never reported on that vote until after it had happened. We were doing our best at EFF and across the digital rights movement to raise the alarm, saying this can't happen, and there was a ton of outrage over the weekend after the House voted. And meanwhile, the press was reporting about Kim Kardashian or whatever. And so I think you're absolutely right that there's a media side of that equation. And I think there's also a civic responsibility side of that equation. I do take a great deal of inspiration from President Eisenhower, who in his departing address to the American people spoke about the need for a, quote, knowledgeable and alert citizenry to defend democracy in America. And it is the fact that we are neither knowledgeable nor alert that I think is largely responsible for us being in this mess that we are dealing with today, the constitutional crisis, the co-optation of federal policy by corporations. All of these are a result, I think, ultimately of that underlying problem that you correctly described.
Wow, absolutely. Absolutely. We quote the Eisenhower speech a lot because, he did it on his way out. He's like, MIC is bad. See ya. He knew not to do it before then. He knew the power that was there. And you're absolutely right. Laura Livengood, what do we have questions, the audience?
I got a couple for you. First, there's been a lot of focus on the Second Amendment. Snorky's wondering, what do you think about the Fourth Amendment and so many cops seizing people's stuff, unreasonable search and seizure? Would you support a law to charge officers with tyranny for seizing and sentencing them to jail?
I'll parse the question because there's two parts of it. So we'll talk about the Fourth Amendment, and then we'll talk about charging cops. So I'm an absolute Fourth Amendment champion, I dare say. I've organized grassroots coalitions in dozens of cities across the country to basically fight police abuses in the political sphere at the local level. In fact, it wasn't very long ago, just in the last couple of weeks, a community here in Northern California adopted a set of Davis, California, basically adopted a police surveillance transparency measure that I spent the last year and a half helping support there in that community, as well as dozens of other communities across the country. So the Fourth Amendment is one to which I'm very, very deeply committed. It has been viciously eroded at the margins and at the center. And I'll try to unpack that. At the margins, it's been eroded by, for instance, limitations on the exclusionary rule as a remedy when the state overreaches. It's also been eroded at the margins by, for instance, impunity for police when retaliating against citizens who exercise their First Amendment rights to, for instance, record police activities. Meanwhile, and all that is to say, by being able to arrest people or by effectively arresting people for trying to record their activities, police have emboldened themselves, intimidated the public, and effectively expanded their authorities without corresponding jurisprudence. The frontal attack on the Fourth Amendment has three letters, NSA. And the idea that you have a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, which I want to make very clear here, is much more than privacy. Is that notion is incompatible with a regime of mass surveillance. And I want to now explain how more than just privacy is implicated in the Fourth Amendment. Despite having a First Amendment, which is to say a commitment to freedom of speech, assembly, the press, the right to petition the government of redress of grievances, as well as religion, we in this country have repeatedly endured attacks by our government on constitutionally protected dissent. If you understand that history of First Amendment dissent suppression, then the implications of contemporary Fourth Amendment search and seizure violations becomes more clear. It's not merely privacy that is at stake when the state claims omniscience into everything that someone has read or written or heard over the course of their lives. What ultimately stands at greatest risk is the freedom of expression on which our democracy rests. I think this is the reason why the Fourth Amendment itself has penumbras that cross over into the First. If you think of the First and the Fourth Amendment together, what we are talking about is not just the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and not just the right to your own opinion. It is ultimately the opportunity for democracy to exist. And we flirt with losing those protections at enormous risk that I think most Americans don't acknowledge. On to the second part of that question with respect to arresting police, I do certainly favor police accountability for violence, for instance, police accountability for profiling. We've talked about those issues. Charging police with tyranny, I think, might be a stretch. But I do think that there is an important role to play for police accountability. And I will say this, qualified immunity is a doctrine when if a police officer, for instance, shoots you and leaves you alive, or shoots a relative of yours and you're suing under their estate, the section of the law under which you sue for constitutional torts is section 1983. It has a defense, qualified immunity, that essentially is the escape hatch for police. And I think it's very important to consider qualified immunity reform. For instance, I would like it to be per se illegal, which is to say liability as a matter of law, for any police officer who kills an unarmed person. There is no perspective from which that can be determined to be reasonable, and qualified immunity should not defend those actions. So I think to your questioner's interests, I would absolutely support liability as a per se matter for police that kill unarmed people. I wouldn't extend that necessarily to searches and seizures that lack a legal basis, particularly because the exclusionary rule, which is the protection from that evidence being used in criminal prosecutions, that is the remedy for those kinds of violations. I know that was a long answer. I hope that was
that was an awesome answer.
Precise.
That was an excellent. I've got another good question. So
yes.
if I
keep them coming, yeah.
That was beautiful, and you organized that very well. Our
yes,
questions can be a little complex sometimes, but Jeffrey's got a good one that's on a lot of people's minds. How do we begin to address capitalism as the cause of our society's problems? And as an Occupy guy, we figure you probably have a good answer to that.
Take 30 seconds. No, just kidding.
I'll start with three words: Medicare-for-All.
Yes.
That is the very simple answer to how we start essentially building in practice alternative distribution systems. My academic research agenda before I became a public interest advocate, my undergrad thesis that got me into Stanford, was about what I describe as a fusion of Smith and Marx. What I remain interested in doing someday is developing exactly that, the distributive justice scheme that unites Smith and Marx. And I think it looks like a market-based system with very robust equality of opportunity. We've never had that before in the world or this country. And a system that eliminated entitlements for established capital could be much more just, while also claiming the efficiencies of capitalism. Before chasing that rabbit, because that's not part of what I'm running on, I do want to go back to where we started, Medicare for all. Maybe as to interrupt myself again, just to summarize that digression, the point of all that is that neither traditional socialism nor traditional capitalism, in my view, offer an answer. They both have gaps. And I think that there are opportunities, particularly through examples of policies that promote collective purchasing and public goods, the opportunity to build alternatives underneath the context of the existing system. So Medicare for All is an example of that. What it would represent is a single purchaser, a government purchaser, for all healthcare services. What that would do is not only drive down the cost of healthcare dramatically by leveraging the government's purchasing power, it would also satisfy a core human right recognized by most civilized countries in the world. It would also keep a lot of people off the street. And don't forget that the corporate healthcare costs that a lot of families are subjected to, untenable corporate healthcare costs, are a large reason why many families end up either facing bankruptcy or outright homelessness. And then finally, I would note that government-paid healthcare would improve the competitiveness of U.S. businesses, both small ones and large ones, that otherwise have to pay the cost of employee health insurance. So if we think about the failures of capitalism in that context and think about alternatives, Medicare for All represents a concrete alternative that is increasingly politically viable. And I would describe that as one of the primary reasons to get this seat in Congress, the one representing California's 12th district, out of the hands of the person who's represented the city for 30 years, because Nancy Pelosi is a stalwart defender of the corporate delivery of healthcare services. And it makes no sense, whether you look at it from a human rights perspective, from a business perspective, whether you look at it, again, from the perspective of preventing homelessness, or from the perspective that your listener raised in terms of demonstrating alternatives. Making sure that we have a single government purchaser for healthcare is long overdue.
Absolutely. I just wanted to point out that this article shows that Nancy is the most conservative individual in her race right now.
It's true.
And she takes a whole bunch of money from the interests that have no interest in single payer health care. Yeah.
That's right.
Good.
Yeah,
Good.
I mean, as much as Nancy Pelosi has, represented San Francisco and Washington, she's also represented Washington and San Francisco,
Yes.
and everywhere else.
She's
more representative of Washington than of our city, I dare say.
Very much so. When you were talking about San Francisco and how it is and what it means to you and inclusionary, and I'm like, that's not the San Francisco that donates to Nancy. Not that I'm aware of. Pretty.
Yeah. There's institutional San Francisco and there's grassroots San Francisco, and I'm much more of the latter.
Absolutely, absolutely. Laura, we have any other questions? I didn't mean to hit you.
I've got one.
Want to wait?
Well, it's a little off topic. Hop to it has the question. Did the use of nuclear weapons in World War II and further development in post-war America effectively end congressional control over making war?
Fascinating question.
Yeah.
I think not, if only because, well, for two reasons. One, I'd locate the marginalization of Congress with respect to its war-making authority to other factors than merely nuclearization. I think nuclearization was certainly a part of it. Mm-hmm. But, I go back here again to Eisenhower. And maybe even to push back against, John's construction of it. This could be a good chance for us to have, some a fun debate. I think of Eisenhower as someone who did what he had to do, and then on his way out said, "Look out! And he says in his speech, I had to build this new confluence between industry and military to fight the Nazis." He describes it as unique in the American and the human experience, and he goes on to explain how the emergence of defense plus the profit motive in particular would shift the character of the country. He described it shifting at every city and city council even in the country. He described it having a spiritual impact, which is fascinating to just think about a war hero U.S. president talking about the spiritual impact of the union of industry and defense. And I think that ultimately is what is driving the aggrandizement of executive power and the marginalization of Congress. If we look at it historically, this is the second reason I'd quibble maybe with that characterization, was in the 70s that Congress passed the War Powers Act, particularly responding to the abuses pervading the war in Vietnam, which, you know, like the war in Iraq, was based on false pretenses. Like the war in Iraq was essentially a colonial aggression. Like the war in Iraq, you know, leaving thousands of Americans dead and millions of people from the countries that we invaded. And like the war in Iraq, undermining our authority in the world and ultimately undermining national security by demonstrating the inadequacy of military strength as a means of guarding our interests. And maybe I'd just leave it at that. I mean, I'm riffing on the question now a little bit, but I think that gets across what I want to say.
I think you killed it. I mean, yeah, it was a little off base, but it comes back to really what, you know, the military industrial complex and I like your description of what you're talking about with Eisenhower there. That was good. That's a much more complete understanding than I ever had. Right. To me, it was just a warning. I think maybe he built it. I had to build it. And then as he left, he was like, and it's out of the cage. It's gone.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true as well. I would hope that he had a sincere aim in setting up his successors to do something about it. And of course they didn't. And that's a big part of the reason why we're in this mess.
Yeah, and maybe it's just me being older. Well, you were the same age, but thinking us being older than the young crowd coming up and progressives is that
the whippersnappers.
Yes, the whippersnappers now, because we can call them that. Something to me says there were men with better integrity in our government at that point in time, and I don't know. That's just me. Maybe not, but I don't see a lot of men of that kind of character in our federal government today.
I do see a lot of women with that character, though. I'll say that. I mean, I see the Liz Warrens of the world, and the Maxine Waters of the world, and the Barbara Lees of the world. You know, there are certainly some very powerful and admirable stateswomen in our Congress. Despite, I think you're right. We do not generally witness acts of civic statesman-like behavior from certainly the man in the White House. I mean, if you think about the occupants of the presidency since then, it has been an unfortunate. Unfortunate is the least of the words we could use here. I mean, to think about the present occupant of the White House in the context of his forebears, it is. It's not just outrageous. I mean, I want to make this point really clear.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is a dire threat to more or less everything we know and hold dear. You know, the age of reason, rights to equal protection, you know, the opportunity for anybody, whatever the color of their skin, to walk down the street safely. These are issues that are dramatically shifting under our feet. And so many Americans, I think, have a false sense of security about what our civilization is about. And I fear that, you know, we need to be absolutely, we have to take Eisenhower's warning and be knowledgeable and alert to what is happening and respond accordingly. And that's a big part of the reason why I've been engaged in so much resistance for the last 15 years. And why I think that I'd be a better alternative for the city, knowing that we need real resistance in Washington to this administration especially.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have another conversation on that. I want to have a debate with all of the progressives around it, because to me, Obama was the ultimate facade. I was sucked in, believed it, and he was business as usual for neoliberals. Hillary would have been the same. And so while I agree that Trump represents an existential threat to all of humanity, it woke our asses up.
Same thing for the Bush administration. You know, I think a lot of people in the Bush years realized that they had a false sense of security. You know, the Patriot Act radicalized, you know, a generation of people. I think similarly, the 2008 financial crisis radicalized a generation of people. And I think appropriately so, the election of a kleptocrat radicalized a generation of people. And unfortunately, as much as these successive generations have been radicalized, you know, the events that have inspired them to emerge have only compounded. So, you know, we find ourselves as a people, I think, increasingly on our heels fighting an establishment, an institutional establishment, with faces across both of the major corporate parties. And I think that is the generational challenge we have, that we face, is to shrug off that duopoly, to seek real solutions to the needs that our country confronts, everything from the healthcare crisis to the climate crisis. And that's, again, you know, why we're here.
Absolutely, and I just want to tie that into your core issue, which you've stated is really the corruption of money in politics and eliminating that, and a campaign finance reform. And what do you, how do you do that? What's your answer for that? You got all sorts of
great questions. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of my first cases, I'll start with a story and then I'll go to my solution. One of my very first cases when I came out of law school, the firm that I worked at, based in San Francisco in the DC office, it put me on a pro bono case, Shays versus FEC. Chris Shays was a Republican member of the House. He and Marty Meehan from Massachusetts were the House co-sponsors of the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. This was a law that aimed to take corporate soft money out of elections. And so I came out of law school in 2003. At the time, the Federal Election Commission was trying to promulgate regulations that basically would have watered down several of the aims of the act, and we defended it, the act, against the Federal Election Commission's regulations before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won that case. Wow. 4 years before the Supreme Court came in the Citizens United decision and basically just destroyed everything that we'd worked to defend.
Wow.
And so, I have a particular concern around this issue. Before I get to my solution for it, I'll just note the other case that I then brought to the firm that occupied most of the rest of the time I was there was one of the first marriage equality cases on the East Coast. And we could come back to that maybe in a little bit. I raised that only because the contrast between the two cases explains a little bit of how my career evolved. And that particular case, the marriage equality case, I think demonstrates what I would describe as my boldness as a social change agent. But to come back to your question about what is my plan for campaign finance, there are a whole host of threats to the integrity of our elections. Campaign finance inequities is one of them. Another would be voter suppression.
Yes.
We know when the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act just 3 years ago, it basically it opened the floodgates to particularly Republican states passing laws to deny their residents, opportunities to vote.
Right.
In addition to that, gerrymandering, where the parties, collude at the state legislature level to basically divide the territory, that is to say the voters, between themselves. All of these issues would represent potential violations of antitrust laws if antitrust laws applied to political and not just economic markets. One of the things I would like to do in Congress is to extend existing antitrust protections so that federal judges, despite the challenges we observed before to the federal judiciary, but to put judges in a position to defend competition in political markets. That kind of a legislative move to create a broad authority to essentially allow the development of a common law of political competition is dramatically different than the historical mode of response to these problems. I would describe campaign finance reform or trying to address corporate personhood or, reforms to address gerrymandering or voting rights. All of those are kind of like a whack-a-mole strategy. And if there's anything we should have learned from the history, it's that campaigns and political parties innovate faster than Congress can legislate to protect the process. So whatever you might do to try to guard the political process, the parties and the candidates are going to find their way around. They're going to circumvent them. They're going to, game the process. The only way to meaningfully defend the political process is to give judges a broad authority to intervene to defend competition. And the reason I say that is that at the end of the day, our political process is, you could describe it as analogous to capitalism in that voters are consumers, the politicians are like companies, and elections are the markets. And the very same processes that allow the aggregation of interest that work so well in the market, according to some, could work well in our politics if we liberated choice and competition and fairness in elections and gave judges a mandate to pursue them. So rather than a narrow campaign finance fix, I would prefer to see a broader fix that would address a bunch of other problems at once. And particularly, the last point I'll make here, if Congress makes a move like that, legislating an extension of antitrust laws, what will happen over the successive generations, I'm not just thinking about an election cycle here, I'm thinking about, what is the forward going paradigm?
Sure.
What would happen over the next generation is the emergence of competing precedents. Different judges in different places will reach different decisions about what violates fairness and competition and what doesn't. And then over time, there will actually be a debate within these courts. That's what the judicial system is. It only works if trial judges are empowered to at least try to intervene if they are so inclined. And I won't make the argument that it's going to fix all the problems, because anytime you put the solution in the hands of the judiciary, it's sort of like a dice roll, you know, which judge do you get? And are they a jurist that was, you know, appointed to subvert the law, as many of Trump's and Bush's judges were, or is it a jurist who's there to promote it? But at the end of the day, I think it's crucial to allow that differentiation to happen. And I am particularly concerned about the closing off the opportunity for future candidates and parties to innovate in a way that undermines the integrity of our election system, even if we try to defend it today.
All right, so I've got probably a really simple question for all of that, because I understand the overarching concept of letting our judicial system regulate the election process, which I think is what you were saying, so that they can make sure bad stuff isn't going on, like gerrymandering, where we've seen judges come down and say, you got to do this, or with Scott Walker, where they said, look, go have a damn election, you can't delay it, things like that. But
right.
What about just in general publicly funded elections? And you know, do you see that as maybe a potential to even the playing field and make sure we don't have to deal with this shit?
Yes, though I want to give two caveats. I'll talk about a policy that an ally of mine developed once, but then I'll also just note institutional fitness, and I'll do that in reverse order.
All right.
I'm running for the U.S. House, which is to say, you know, most election law is determined at the state level. It's state legislatures that determine the parameters for their respective campaign finance regimes in the states. Federal election law is actually quite thin. The one place that it really had teeth in the past was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which the right-wing Supreme Court struck down a few years ago. So nice. All that is to say that there's not a lot in Congress we can do to advance public finance. There was a proposal that Spencer Overton, a law professor, and then he went into the Obama administration. I'm not sure what he's doing now. But Spencer had a proposal to essentially equip low-income Americans with a tax credit that then could be applied as a low-dollar political contribution to candidates who they might want to support in primaries. Basically, his analysis went like this, and you might describe this as part of the reason why we're having a corporate control crisis. It's only 2% of the American public that donates to political campaigns. And while anybody has a right to vote, that is to say, to choose who among the selected candidates you would propose seeing in office, the choice among who will the selected candidates be, that falls down basically to the 2% of the donor class, which is to say, working Americans rarely have an opportunity to influence whose names are on the ballot before they then have the chance to vote for them. Spencer's proposal would basically give people the opportunity to exercise influence at that early stage in the process. And that's particularly why public financing is so important, because it would enable opportunities for candidates who represent working class interests, as opposed to just corporations, to gain access to the resources necessary to get the word out about their campaigns. A whole host of jurisdictions have structured public financing arrangements that work like a match, where you raise some baseline amount of resources as a candidate, and then that qualifies you for more. Here in San Francisco, our municipal elections have a public financing option. I think it's a powerful alternative, and from a public policy standpoint, it's critical to make sure that elections and candidacy is available to all people, not just anointed representatives of corporate interests.
Rich folks. Okay.
Exactly. Right.
For the most part. So if I understood you, I'm going to just dumb that down to my if I understood what you just said, it's actually easier for us to make those laws happen at the state level. And that's actually encouraging, because I've seen, now that I've been doing this for a whole 3 years with Bernie, that we can actually make change at the state level. We can actually make change at the state. There's way more power going on there than we have federally, right?
That's exactly right. And in two dimensions, it's not only the case that the state legislatures are more nimble, because remember, Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives has 435 people in it, right? Like, trying to steer any ship with 435 people with their hand on the wheel, like, good luck with that, right?
Most of whom are uneducated.
That too, right? Actually, I would love to riff on that at some point. We don't exactly select members of Congress typically for how steep they are in policy. We tend to select them based on how much money they can raise,
right?
Which I think is a real problem. But
Lamar Smith, I'm just going to go there.
Nancy Pelosi, perhaps. I mean,
Well,
anyway,
how do that's I just got to. I want to change the rules that decide that the members of Congress get to decide which members of Congress get which roles. That should be us. Lamar Smith should not be in anything that has space, science, or technology listed in it because he's an idiot. That's
right.
I
mean, it's kind of interesting. It makes you think about how Betsy DeVos probably shouldn't have anything to do with education.
Well, we got a whole clown car of friggin' people thanks to Trump's office. That's but so I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were going off there.
No, it's good. And now I forgot where we started. Can you just remind me of the?
That's all right. I think we were just basically talking about campaign finance reform and how to reform it. And I brought up public elections, and you're saying, look, the power's at the states, right?
Yes, the states, right? Yeah. So on the one hand, the state legislatures are smaller, so they're easier to steer, but they're also more empowered. People forget this. Congress has only enumerated powers. The Constitution specifies the powers that Congress has, and there's a whole wing of jurisprudence to limit the federal government's power to do things like reach into state affairs.
Right.
And states have, especially on issues like policing, states have way more authority than the federal government does. Election law, similarly, states have way more authority than does the federal government. The federal government has a great deal of authority, so much so that it precludes the states from having independent authority on issues like foreign policy, the federal tax and spending issues. But when it comes down to the issues that a lot of people care the most about, state legislatures are a widely overlooked area of enormous opportunity. And if you're familiar with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, this is a right-wing group that basically promotes corporate-friendly policies that are adopted at the state legislative layer. Typically, the conservatives have turned their sights both on the federal judiciary and on state legislatures as crucial levers to promote their policy vision. And progressives, again, when we think about the Clinton and the Obama administrations not responding in kind in their judicial appointments, it's also the case that the progressive movement has generally not responded as nimbly, at least at the state legislative layer. That's one reason why I'm very happy to live in California, where we have a much more enlightened state legislative process than in many parts of the country.
Wow. An education from Shahid Buttar, candidate for California's 12th Congressional District. Thank you so much for being with us. We are out of time, man. I'd love to just go on for another hour. You're so
kind. Thank you for bringing me on. I appreciate all the questions. I'd love to be back with you another time. Keep up the great work and let me know anything I can do to help.
Yeah, we are definitely going to do it again because I want to get all the progressives together that are trying to defeat Nancy Pelosi and just have them all talk about why.
I'd be so excited for that.
Yeah. We're reaching out to who's the last gentleman, Laura. I can't remember his name.
What's his name?
There's a third. Here, I have
Ryan Kojaste.
Ryan, yeah. They're the three Democrats, and then there's Barry Hermanson running on the Green Party ticket.
Okay, we'll get him too. We'll invite Nancy, although I don't think she'll show up. we had this slide made with Nancy freaking out. It was the three of you running there.
Maybe we could just have her voice taped, to play while you show that slide. That could be an alternative.
Yeah. If that's the case, I will play Nancy, and that will be fun. That will be fun. I would love to do that. You were awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And we have everybody. It gets even better. Actually, I didn't even get a chance to really go through all of your resume. You're also a DJ, a musician, and you turned your passion into you put your passion into this, and I love that because. Me too. Guitar's over here in the corner, although I don't do rhyme, do different things. But still, I get it. And one of the things we do here, one of the reasons I'm so excited about that is because we made an effort with Bernie TV and throughout this whole thing to bring music into our, shows. It's like democracy needs to rock. It's so damn boring, and it really needs to just, rock. So, tell us about your own piece, NSA versus USA.
Yeah, sure. So this was when the Snowden revelations happened. I was very concerned. The earliest form of my activism before I went to law school, long before I went to law school, took the form of politicized spoken word poetry. So I'm a documentary performance poet first.
Nice.
And that song, NSA versus USA, is basically a hip hop history lesson about the serial recurrence of politicization in our government's surveillance apparatus. And it connects Snowden to the plot against Dr. King, and it basically explains to people why the agencies need to be erased.
That's wow. light fare. It's you know.
With a bass line to keep you grooving in the meantime, you know. But yeah, it's you know, I like to move people's minds alongside their behinds, and this song is a good example of that.
It's awesome. You are awesome. We will definitely have you back. We will definitely be doing some kind of town hall or debate or something with you. Shahid Buttar, thank you for joining us. Thank you for running.
Thank you for having me, John. You're very kind.
Thank you. It was awesome.
Yes.
Thanks everybody for being here.
And oh, here we got your last slide. Tell everybody where they can go to connect with you, donate, volunteer.
Yeah. You can find us online at Shahid for Change. The Twitter handle there is my personal one. Shahid for Change will reach the campaign. You can see us there on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And we're online at shahidforchange.us.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
NSA versus USA.
The NSA breaks the law every day. It doesn't matter who you are or what you say. They monitor your phone calls and emails anyway. Corrupt Congress and courts paving the way. There's a lesson you'll learn someday. Watch what you say. See, they spy on your mind, record your calls for posterity, commit daily executive crimes with impunity. They're the authorities here to keep us safe until the boot ends up on your face. It's the NSA against the Constitution. We the people are the ones our government is abusing. We can force any agency to make a new choice when we build a movement, each raising our voice. They lie about the origins of the evidence. They lie about the numbers of Americans watched. Immense too large for them to calculate, they cite. A self-serving lie by the government's eye. Computing power unmatched in history. Presuming the power to wiretap humanity. It's insanity how large the hubris looms. The government's watching you in the bathroom, and they lie about it at every opportunity. Sustained abuses of every community. Unity across Washington, D.C. All three branches against the people we see. Bush signed a secret presidential decree. Obama talked a big game, but presidentially did everything he could to entrench the Bush legacy. A complex composed of military industry. Eisenhower 60 years before anticipated it'd be rising in the wings for generations growing. A crisis in democracy sowing the futures at stake. You could start by knowing. It's the NSA against the Constitution. We the people are the ones our government is abusing. We can force any agency to make a new choice when we build a movement, each raising our voice. 400 years since World War I, the FBI versus free speech has held a gun. Constitutional rights on the run. The Palmer raised the first, but not the last one. Fast forward 40 years to the real Red Scare. McCarthy did a number, but the FBI was there. They were everywhere. They knew what you were to bed. They prosecuted people for the thoughts in our heads. What does it mean to monitor thoughts? Spying means a lot more than watching what you bought. It's the feds always knowing what you've got in your head. Not only whoever with whom you share your bed, but whether you're compliant or a threat instead. A head like MLK to be neutralized. The word the FBI used decades of lies. Exposed, revealed as institutionalized. Surveillance drones, automatic license detections, eclipsing universities. We must all resist, or we'll be destroyed.